Ethan had convinced himself that starting over was a simple equation: new city, new routines, fewer memories. When the bus crossed the city limits, he watched familiar streets fade behind tinted glass and told himself this was progress. No one here knew his history. No one expected him to be the person he used to be. That anonymity felt like oxygen. At 29, Ethan wasn't running from scandal or disaster. What he was escaping was quieter and more dangerous, comfort that had slowly turned into emotional numbness. His relationship with Mark had lasted nearly 5 years, long enough to become woven into habits instead of choices. Mark knew Ethan's coffee order, his morning moods, and the exact silence that meant he'd had a hard day. On paper, it was everything people called stable. In Ethan's chest, though, something had gone missing. The new apartment was small, clean, and echoingly empty. Ethan liked that. He unpacked carefully, lining books on the shelf as if arranging evidence of a person he still wanted to believe he was. Each object placed felt like a promise: this time, I'll do better. He texted Mark that night, settled in. Call you tomorrow. It was affectionate, responsible, and oddly hollow. Ethan's new job at a downtown design firm demanded focus, and he welcomed the distraction. Mornings became structured, efficient, predictable. He told himself that distance would help him appreciate what he had. When Mark called, their conversations followed a script: updates, jokes, reassurances. Neither mentioned the pauses that lingered too long or the way excitement had slowly drained from their voices. At night, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments he couldn't quite define as regrets. He told himself relationships weren't supposed to feel thrilling forever. Love, he reasoned, matured into something quieter. Still, the thought didn't comfort him. It felt like surrender disguised as wisdom. The city, however, refused to let him hide completely. On his third week, after a long afternoon of meetings, Ethan stopped at a small cafe near the office. It was the kind of place designed for lingering: warm lights, mismatched chairs, low music that blurred into thought. He ordered a drink and checked his phone, skimming Mark's latest message without replying right away. He needed a minute to breathe without explaining himself. That was when the door opened. Ethan didn't look up at first. He noticed the shift in the room instead: the pause in conversation, the subtle change in energy that happens when someone familiar enters a space you thought was safely anonymous. When he finally raised his eyes, his chest tightened. Lucas stood near the counter, scanning the menu with casual focus. Older than Ethan remembered, but unmistakable. The same posture, the same quiet confidence that had once unsettled him in the best way. Time had sharpened Lucas rather than softening him, and the realization landed like a misplaced memory resurfacing. Ethan hadn't seen Lucas in years. They hadn't ended badly, they'd simply stopped, suspended by poor timing and unspoken truths. Back then, Ethan had chosen certainty over curiosity. He had chosen Mark. Seeing Lucas now felt like a test he hadn't studied for. For a moment, Ethan considered leaving. The exit was close enough, the excuse easy. But his body refused to cooperate. Lucas turned, recognition flickering across his face before settling into a small, surprised smile. Ethan. Lucas said, as if the name still belonged to him. Ethan nodded, forcing his expression into something neutral. I didn't know you lived here. I didn't, Lucas replied. Just moved back. The coincidence felt deliberate, almost cruel. They exchanged pleasantries, safe, surface-level words that barely masked the tension underneath. Ethan was acutely aware of how easily conversation returned, how natural it felt to stand there with Lucas as if no years had passed. When Lucas excused himself to wait for his order, Ethan finally exhaled. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Mark, again. Ethan didn't check the message. He stared at the door instead, watching Lucas's reflection in the glass. That he had wanted a fresh start. He had planned for discipline, distance, and clarity. What he hadn't planned for was the past walking in unannounced, carrying questions he had never truly answered. As Ethan left the cafe, he knew one thing with uncomfortable certainty: the city no longer felt neutral. And whatever he had come here to escape was already catching up to him. Ethan told himself that running into Lucas again was nothing more than coincidence, a brief disturbance that would fade with time. Yet the following week proved him wrong. Lucas appeared again, this time outside the office building, leaning against the railing as if he'd always belonged there. The city, it seemed, was smaller than Ethan had believed. Their conversations began innocently. A coffee after work. A shared laugh about how little some things changed. Lucas asked questions that felt attentive without being intrusive, and Ethan found himself answering more honestly than he intended. With Lucas, he didn't have to explain who he was becoming. Lucas remembered who he had been. Mark, meanwhile, existed through screens and voices. Their calls grew shorter, less patient. Ethan noticed how often he delayed responding, how frequently he rehearsed his tone before answering. He told himself it was temporary stress, the adjustment period of a move. Still, guilt hovered, sharp and persistent. Lucas never spoke badly of Mark. In fact, he rarely mentioned him at all. That absence made the space between them louder. Instead, Lucas talked about his own return to the city, about unfinished chapters and the strange comfort of familiarity. Ethan listened, recognizing the same restlessness mirrored back at him. One evening, as they walked along the river after work, Lucas asked, "Are you happy?" The question wasn't loaded, but it landed heavily. Ethan hesitated too long before answering, and that silence said more than words could have. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. It was the first time he'd said it aloud. That night, Ethan lay awake replaying the conversation. He thought of Mark, reliable, loving, steady. He also thought of the version of himself that laughed more easily around Lucas, that felt seen rather than understood by habit. The contrast unsettled him. He hadn't touched Lucas, hadn't crossed any visible lines, yet something inside him had already shifted. Mark sensed it. During their next call, his voice carried an unfamiliar caution. "You feel far away," he said. "Did I do something?" Ethan assured him no, quickly, too quickly. The lie was subtle, wrapped in half-truths. He didn't mention Lucas. He didn't mention the growing ache he couldn't name without unraveling everything. Days blurred into a pattern Ethan pretended not to notice. Messages from Mark went unanswered for hours. Conversations with Lucas grew longer, more personal. They spoke about fears, regrets, the choices that defined them. Ethan began to look forward to those moments, measuring his days by them. He told himself it was harmless. He wasn't cheating, at least not in the way people usually meant. Yet each shared glance, each unguarded confession, pulled him further from the life he claimed to protect. Emotional boundaries dissolved quietly, without ceremony. The breaking point arrived without drama. Lucas and Ethan sat across from each other in the same cafe where they'd first reconnected. Rain pressed against the windows, muting the world outside. Lucas studied Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "You know this isn't nothing," Lucas said softly. Ethan didn't argue. He couldn't. His chest felt tight, his thoughts scattered. "I never meant for it to become this," he said. Lucas nodded. "I know. But intentions don't change what's happening." The truth settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Ethan realized that even if he walked away now, the damage was already done. He had let someone else into the space that belonged to his relationship. He had betrayed Mark without ever touching another man. When Ethan returned home that night, Mark's name glowed on his phone again. This time, Ethan didn't ignore it. He stared at the screen, aware that whatever he said next would set everything in motion. For the first time since arriving in the city, Ethan understood the cost of his silence. The fresh start he'd wanted was no longer possible. All that remained was a choice, one that would force him to confront who he truly was, and who he was willing to hurt to find out. That he answered the call, knowing that nothing would be the same after this. Mark didn't raise his voice when Ethan finally told the truth. That restraint unsettled Ethan more than anger ever could. The silence on the line stretched, heavy and deliberate, as if Mark were choosing which part of himself to protect. "So there's someone else," Mark said at last. It wasn't an accusation. It was a conclusion. "Not like that," Ethan replied instinctively, then stopped himself. He realized how hollow the defense sounded. "But yes." I let it happen. Mark exhaled slowly. You moved away to fix us, he said. And instead, you found something you didn't want to name. The accuracy of it stung. Ethan tried to explain how lonely he'd felt, how the distance had magnified doubts he'd buried for years. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that explanations didn't soften betrayal. They only clarified its shape. They spoke for over an hour, revisiting memories that now felt fragile. Mark admitted he had sensed the shift long before Ethan did, had waited for him to choose honesty. I would have listened, Mark said. If you'd trusted me enough to tell me you were drifting. That truth landed with quiet devastation. Ethan realized his mistake hadn't been falling for someone else. It had been his fear of facing discomfort, his decision to protect stability over transparency. When the call ended, nothing was resolved. But something had ended. The relationship that once felt unbreakable now existed only in memory and careful words. Ethan didn't see Lucas for several days after that. He avoided familiar streets, declined invitations, and sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the life he had built on the promise of control. The silence forced reflection. He wasn't proud of his choices, and he refused to pretend otherwise. Eventually, Lucas texted. Are you okay? Ethan hesitated before replying. I told him. Lucas understood what that meant. They met again, not out of excitement, but necessity. This time, there was no casual warmth, no pretending the tension was accidental. I don't want to be the reason you break something, Lucas said. Even if I care about you. Ethan appreciated the honesty. It echoed the truth he'd been avoiding. I already broke it, he admitted. That part's on me. What followed wasn't a declaration or a promise. There was no rush toward something new. Instead, there was restraint, an acknowledgement that desire didn't erase consequence. Lucas stepped back, giving Ethan the space he should have asked for long ago. Weeks passed. Ethan and Mark spoke again, briefly, with a careful civility shaped by shared history. They didn't reunite. Some fractures, Ethan learned, couldn't be mended by remorse alone. Still, the conversation offered closure, a mutual understanding that what they had mattered, even if it couldn't continue. Ethan's days grew quieter, but also clearer. He stopped blaming the city, the distance, or timing. He accepted that infidelity wasn't a single act but a series of small choices fueled by avoidance. He hadn't been unfaithful because he was unhappy, he had been unhappy because he refused to confront himself. On a late afternoon walk, Ethan passed the cafe where everything had begun. He paused, not to go inside, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, a turning point, not a tragedy. He realized that a fresh start didn't come from running forward or backward. It came from standing still long enough to be honest. Ethan didn't know what the future held, with Lucas or anyone else. That uncertainty no longer frightened him. For the first time in years, he felt aligned with himself, even if it meant being alone. He continued walking, carrying no illusions, only accountability. And while the path ahead was unclear, it was finally his to choose. Time did not rush to heal Ethan. Instead, it moved with deliberate slowness, forcing him to live inside the consequences he could no longer escape. The city that once promised anonymity now reflected him back at every corner. Without Mark's steady presence or Lucas's charged familiarity, Ethan faced something unfamiliar, himself, unfiltered. He returned fully to his routines, but they felt different now. Work no longer served as distraction, it became a mirror. He noticed how often he avoided difficult conversations, how easily he mistook silence for peace. The realization was uncomfortable, yet grounding. For the first time, Ethan wasn't trying to perform stability for anyone else. Mark remained a quiet presence in his thoughts. Their last conversation echoed often, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Ethan understood now that love demanded courage long before it demanded loyalty. He had failed not because he felt something new, but because he hid from the truth of what he felt old. Slipping away. One evening, Lucas reappeared, not unexpectedly, but intentionally. They met in a public park, neutral ground chosen without discussion. The tension between them had changed. It no longer pressed forward, it waited. "You look different," Lucas said. "I feel different," Ethan replied. He meant it. They spoke carefully, aware that timing mattered more than desire. Lucas didn't ask for assurances, and Ethan didn't offer them. What existed between them had not vanished, but it had been stripped of fantasy. They acknowledged what could have been, without insisting it still must be. "I don't want to repeat old patterns," Ethan said. "Not with you. Not with anyone." Lucas nodded, respecting the boundary. "Then don't," he said simply. That restraint felt like growth. Not resolution, but responsibility. As weeks turned into months, Ethan began to rebuild, not a relationship, but an internal compass. He reconnected with friends he had neglected, admitted uncertainties he once buried, and learned to sit with discomfort without reaching for escape. The loneliness didn't disappear, but it softened, losing its edge. One afternoon, Ethan received a message from Mark. It wasn't an invitation or an accusation, just a note of closure. Mark had moved on, found steadiness again. The news brought relief and regret in equal measure. Ethan wished him well, meaning it fully. Letting go, he realized, was also a form of love. Standing alone on his balcony that night, Ethan reflected on the phrase, "fresh start." He had misunderstood it. A fresh start wasn't about erasing the past or rewriting identity. It was about carrying truth forward without distortion. The city lights flickered below, indifferent and alive. Ethan felt no urgency to define his future. He understood now that certainty was overrated, and honesty was not. Whatever came next, love, solitude, or something unnamed, would begin without pretense. That he closed the door behind him, not to shut anything out, but to remain present. And for the first time since leaving everything familiar behind, Ethan wasn't running towards something new or away from something broken. That he was simply moving forward, aware, accountable, and finally prepared for whatever waited next.